Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Stroud Municipal Center. My name is David Moore. I'm the town administrator. On behalf of our board chair, Mike Houghton, vice chair, Joe Lovejoy, who's with us this evening, and select board member Allison Knapp, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming to this informational night regarding PFAS in town center. We have a presentation for you this evening, which is intended to provide a deep background on the PFAS issue globally as well as locally and in our town center here, followed by the presentation which will be delivered by Jim Ricker of Wilcox & Barton. Wilcox & Barton is the environmental engineering firm that's been secured by the select board to assist us in following up on this contamination issue in the town center. Following the presentation, we're going to do some Q&A because I know there's many questions and concerns from a number of people in town center, throughout the town, with the fire department. We want to address those tonight as best we can, and we look forward to doing that. After tonight, we want to continue to keep you updated about the information that we have and the new information that we will come to learn, and the process that will play out regarding this issue. There's a few ways we're going to do that. If you haven't signed up yet over here, please do so. You can also go to the town's website and sign up for the select board newsletter. Click on subscribe to news. Make sure you click on select board newsletter, and we'll be able to keep you up to date that way. We will also make tonight's presentation available on the town's website, as well as a record and a summary of the Q&A that takes place tonight. The presentation will go up right away tomorrow morning, and the summary will follow. You can keep track of all of these information about this on a dedicated section of the town's website under PFAS as well. So please continue to look for that information, and we'll continue to push it out as fast as we can. I want to recognize other people in the audience tonight, including Representative Pat Abrami, who's here. We also have members of the town staff who are here, Karen Richard, the executive assistant in the town offices, who will be helping us with the record tonight and monitoring the Q&A. Of course, we have Fire Chief here, and we have Matt Larrabee, and our Public Works Director, Nate Mears, is also here. Special welcome to the members of the Stratham Volunteer Fire Department. Thank you for being here, as well as the rest of the members of the public who have made time for this evening. So with that, I want to recognize and ask Jim Ricker to take over with his presentation. Jim has worked closely on this issue, become somewhat of a specialist on PFAS in New Hampshire, has worked in other sites in New Hampshire, and has a relationship with DES, who is, of course, the key regulator that we are working to satisfy and cooperate with as part of this process. So, Jim, thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you for the town for having me here. I hope you'll find this to be informational and helpful, and I hope you leave with a little more knowledge about kind of a complicated topic than you came in here with. So if at any time anyone can't hear me or you missed something, please just raise your hand. Hopefully we'll be able to see all these slides here tonight. A couple of them might get washed out, but I also have a laser pointer that we use for my cat, so it's very helpful. So the objectives for tonight, just kind of want to start at the top with just an overview of what PFAS is. I don't have any way of knowing what you understand about it, what you don't understand about it. It can be a fairly complicated topic. So I'm going to try to give the good information without getting too nerdy and confusing. As David mentioned, we'll take a look at some of the PFAS sites here throughout the state, and just an idea of how did it come to Stratham? How did we get to where we are today? And then the DES's request to conduct a focused site investigation, which included groundwater and drinking water sampling, We're going to touch on the Stratham Municipal Landfill. It's not a site that we have sampled, but we want to kind of incorporate it into this discussion because it does include PFAS as well. And then kind of a what's next? What do we do now that we have this information? What's the state going to do? What should the town do? And we'll have certainly a Q&A session. This is, I think, like my son's math class. I try to tell him, if you don't understand something at the beginning, don't just sit there quiet. Raise your hand because it gets more and more complicated. If you don't understand at the beginning, you'll get lost later on. I don't want that to happen. So please, even though we have a Q&A session, please feel free, just flag me down and say, can you explain that again? I didn't quite get it. So, if you missed the opening slide, PFAS, what exactly is this stuff? So, the acronym, if you like acronyms, PFAS is the place to go because it's full of them. But this particular one, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are man-made compounds that were developed starting around the 1940s by companies like 3M and DuPont. They're primarily made for non-stick, waterproofing, stain-proofing, grease-resistant products. So think about Teflon, the Scotch Guard material that goes on furniture. I see like Sunbrella from Jordan's Furniture, and you can pour like anything on that stuff and it washes right off. It never sticks. It makes me wonder, does that have some kind of PFAS component to it? But it's in everything, Stainmaster carpets, sandwich wrappers that keeps the grease from leaking through, the little cardboard disc at the bottom of your pizza box, the inside of a microwave popcorn bag that keeps the grease from getting out. It's in wire coatings, lip balm, cosmetics, aluminum foil. I love the Reynolds wrap, the no stick. The reason it doesn't stick is because it works because it probably has PFAS in it. So the large issue here is it's in so many products that can be found, can be commercially purchased, that you get at a sandwich shop, and can end up in landfills. Another component of PFAS is its use in Class B firefighting foams. These are foams that are used for liquid petroleum fires, or you might hear it called AFFF, aqueous film forming foams. Where's my little cat toy here? So there's about 4,500 of these. I've heard as few as 3,000, maybe as many as 5,000 of these chemicals out there. A little lesson, the difference between per and polyfluorinated. The per-fluorinated compounds are the ones where all these carbon atoms are fully bonded to fluorine. This carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest in nature, really, really effective, but it lasts. It's very difficult to break down. So this particular one happens to be perfluorooctane sulfonate, PFOS, which is a component in firefighting foam that we'll hear a little bit about. So this is the carbon chain. This is an 8-carbon chain. You see it's fully fluorinated. And this little head here, this is a hydrophilic head. It likes to stick its head in the water, and the rest of the tail kind of sticks up on end like that, and it becomes that buffer between the two surfaces. Very, very effective. So a question that I hear a lot is, okay, so what does this mean to me? How does it affect my health, or does it affect my health? These products, the chemicals do end up in the food chain. They can get into fish if there's PFAS in a pond, and they get into the fish. You eat the fish; it's part of the food chain. You could get it that way. I mentioned polar bears here. No one's eating polar bears, but the reason I bring it up is because this stuff is so ubiquitous in the world. It gets up into smokestacks at industries and factories that produce these compounds. It gets up into the jet stream, and it goes worldwide. I mean, they have found it in the blood and fat tissues of polar bears in the North Pole. So it just gives you an idea of how this stuff can stretch out on a global perspective. On a health effects basis, largely the testing, I mean, it's relatively a new phenomenon. We've only really been looking at PFAS, for the last decade or so, compared to how far back its production goes. So the testing that's only happened recently has mostly been done on animals, but some of the possible health effects are certain cancers of the bladder and the kidneys, changes in kind of the way your body regulates its system, thyroid levels of cholesterol, birth weights in pregnant women. It can affect hormone levels and sex hormone levels that control puberty. And they're still really taking a look and developing these studies in humans. The half-life, as we say, these compounds have a half-life of somewhere between 2 and 9 years. Now, the half-life, meaning these things won't break down, they're very difficult to destroy, but they do get into your body, and once in there, in the presence of no additional ingestion of these PFAS substances, about half of those will stick around in your body for between 2 and 9 years. And ultimately, they're excreted and they're gone out of your body. So, excuse me 1 second. Thank you.
So that's the half-life in the human body, not in groundwater or?
Correct, in the human body, yep, yes. Once they're in the environment, well, actually, I got it right here on this slide. They're called the forever chemicals because they don't tend to break down. I mentioned the acronyms. This is the alphabet soup of acronyms here. Although there's about 4,500 of these compounds, the ones that the EPA really targets is a list of about 21 here. This is from an EPA Drinking Water Method 537.1. So there's about 21 compounds here. These are the ones that we typically test for, that we included in our investigation. A lot of acronyms here you see, including PFOA and PFOS, who are two of the more popular ones we'll discuss a little bit more. These fluorotelomers here, these are components of the manufacturing process. They're not one of these final end product compounds, but they're substances that we refer to as precursor compounds because they can break down in the environment. So these can break down and they'll form some of these, but other than that, these are very, very stable, and that's why they call them the forever compounds. So in New Hampshire, this is still a relatively new thing in New Hampshire. PFAS has been a bigger issue out in the Midwest at DOD facilities, even in Europe. New Hampshire, not so much. This only really goes back about 5 years when they discovered it in the water supply wells at Pease Air Force Base. I worked at Pease about 25 years ago. I'm very familiar with the fire training process they used to have there. They would take, old fuselages of planes, they would hose them down in jet fuel, set them on fire, wait for the fire department to respond. It was part of their training missions that, if a plane were to come in, especially one of those KC-135 tankers and catch fire, they had to be prepared to put those fires out. So they would use heavy amounts of the AFFF, and then it and the fuel, oil, would end up in the groundwater table. In fact, there was about 4 feet of jet fuel floating on the groundwater table at one of the sites there at Pease. But so the Haven well here is a really, really high producing well. It sits right between Alpha and Bravo taxiways out there. It's an overburden well. It pumps about 550 gallons a minute. I mean, the thing really goes. And when it does kick on, it draws the water table down quite rapidly. I've been maybe a quarter of a mile away from it doing water levels and monitoring wells. And you can tell when it comes on because the water level meter chimes when it hits the water. And it goes beep, beep, beep. I mean, the thing drops like a stone. So it's creating this giant cone of depression, and everything is getting pulled into it. The Harrison and the Smith wells aren't as big producers. I think these two are still online right now. I think the Haven well is still shut down. These two are back on with treatment. But, I mean, this is really the water supply, one of the main water supply sources for Portsmouth and in Newington. About a year or two later, St. Gobain came into focus. St. Gobain Company makes these specialty coatings on papers. And it started in Hoosick Falls, New York. They had a PFAS issue out there. People started to say, okay, well, this issue's here. Where else does St. Gobain operate? Oh, they have a facility in Merrimack, New Hampshire. So they started doing some testing there. This is the smokestack scenario that I spoke of earlier. They're making these papers as a production. It goes up the stack into the atmosphere. It floated over the Merrimack River. On the other side of the river, which was confusing from a hydrogeologic standpoint, how did the stuff get over there? It made it over to the other side of the river, settled out on the ground surface in all these neighborhoods, and through surface water infiltration, snow, rainfall, it made its way down into hundreds of private water supply wells. So it was a big issue there in Merrimack, Londonderry, Amherst, Litchfield, and they're in the process now of really tying all those people into public water supplies right now. They're doing water line extensions to bring water to all those people. Then they started saying, okay, well, if it was in St. Gobain, what was another company like that? And there were companies that spun off of St. Gobain and did similar types of work, made similar products. TCI is Textile Coatings Incorporated, I believe, in Amherst. That became a site. Then they started looking at sites like Coakley Landfill here on the Seacoast area, large municipal landfill, took on a lot of waste from a lot of different places. It's also a Superfund site, but it has large amounts of PFAS. Go ahead.
How many parts per trillion are in these wells that you're talking about?
Well, that'll vary.
Over 70?
Over 70, yes. I mean, some will be in the thousands of parts per trillion, some may be higher. I think, there may be some that are at 5-digit parts per trillion, so that's almost like in parts per billion range. Yeah, but we'll get into that a little bit more as we look at some of the data locally. So, yeah, and there are many others. I mean, we mentioned landfills and fire stations, and that's part of the story to come here. Regulatory history, so, now we've got Saint-Gobain, we've had Ps, now DES says, okay, we gotta think about establishing some kind of a level, an MCL or an ambient groundwater quality standard to address PFAS. The EPA had a health advisory level that they used of 70 parts per trillion. A lot of states kind of went to that. DES initially went to that in May of 2016. So they only looked at PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, and perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. So either of those two, if there was 70 parts per trillion, it was an exceedance, or a combination of the two. So you could have 34 parts per trillion of one and 35 parts per trillion of another, and you'd be okay, because it was under 70. But you could have 36 and 36. Each of those is less than 70, but combined over, so you would exceed. So that's how they initially proceeded with an ambient groundwater quality standard. To give you an idea of what 70 parts per trillion looks like, when I started in this industry, we were looking at stuff at parts per million. And then they got really scientific and they could look down to parts per billion range. Now they're getting into the parts per trillion range. 70 parts per trillion, to kind of visualize this, is roughly the equivalent of one human being in 2 world populations. So if you do the math, you figure out there's about 7.5 trillion people in the world. That's what it works out to be. So looking for that one person in 2 world populations is what 70 parts per trillion looks like. In November of 2016, DES issued their first request to stakeholders who had groundwater management permits, who were doing routine groundwater monitoring, to start including PFAS in their testing. They wanted to get an idea of what this looks like on a statewide basis. Initially, in November, it was a request. They said, we'd like you to do it, and if you're a petroleum facility or retail gas station, you don't have to do it. This is more for the other types of sites, landfills, sites that are near industries, things like that. In April of 2017, they leaned a little bit harder. They said, okay, we're going to start to include the gas stations now, because now we've learned it's also in petroleum products, so pretty much everyone's on board. We're requesting that you do this, and please do it no later than 2018. So people that had groundwater management permits, usually those are once or twice a year, so you really had very limited opportunity of when you're going to do it. It's either like kind of spring or fall. You got to include it and report it back to DES by the end of 2018. So by early this year now, DES has this large database of PFAS sites. They have what they call the Environmental Monitoring Database. You can go on, you can log on. It's got a map of the state, and it has all these green, yellow, and red dots all over the state for where they have detected PFAS at varying levels. They also, at the time, decided they were going to refine the ambient groundwater quality standards a little bit. They were going to lower them. They initially proposed somewhere in the 23 to 85 parts per trillion range, but they also included 2 others in addition to PFOA and PFOS. So that's what they were going with. I actually gave a presentation with DES on June 28th, actually the 26th, and there was a lot of questions. It was about PFAS, and they had a lot of questions about what the new ambient groundwater quality standards are going to look like, and they kind of danced around a little bit, said they were refining the numbers. That Friday, I think it was the 28th, they announced the new standards, which look something like this. So these are the standards that they had to get through the Rules Committee at the state. They have been approved. DES, even though they don't go into effect officially until September 30th, DES has more or less adopted them now. So any new data that's coming in, they're comparing them against these new standards. So it's for these 4 compounds here. They're carboxylic acids and 2 sulfonic acids. Our old friends PFOA and PFOS are here. And the standard for PFOA, 12 nanograms per liter. Nanograms per liter is the equivalent of parts per trillion. PFNA, which I don't see that often. I'm not exactly sure why they flagged that one. I don't see it that often, but that one's at 11. PFOS went to 15, and this one, PFHXS, hexane sulfonic acid. So, I mean, it's really not, there's such small differences in these compounds. I mean, you imagine there's 4,500 of them. There's got to be very slight little differences in the chemical structure that makes them different. Octane being 8 carbons, hexane being 6. That's really the difference there, the main difference. So, very, very low numbers. I mean, especially compared to where they were before when they were at 70. I will say Vermont has a standard now that includes these 4 plus one other, and the combination of those 5 can't be higher than 20. So you could have, 5 parts per trillion, if you had 5, 6, 4, 8, and I don't know if I do the math right. If it adds up to 20, it's over. Those are very, very low numbers. I think one of those wells, the Harrison well, at the time at Pease, was still in the 17 part per trillion range, and they were still pumping it out to the residents as a drinking water because it was under 70. So these numbers, are even lower than that. So just a bit of nomenclature here. When they enacted these and adopted these, they came up with what they call an MCL, a maximum contaminant level. That applies to drinking water data, and the ambient groundwater quality standard, which is compared to groundwater data that you might get out of a monitoring well. It's the same numbers, just different terms for them. An important note, there is currently no regulatory standard for soil, which is a really big deal. It's something they're working towards. It ends up in soil, and it has the ability to leach through that soil to groundwater, but they don't know what is too much. How much in soil creates that problem in groundwater? That's still something that DES and really EPA and everyone, all the regulators are working towards right now. Right, but the question is how much of it in the soil can create that problem. So here are some of the sites as the scope started to expand a little bit. You see very common themes here. There's several landfills. Landfills like Merrimack. Some of these, like Merrimack landfill, was taking some wastes from St. Cobain themselves, and some fill and things like that for landfill cover. And so that was creating an issue as well. So a lot of these landfills, these municipal landfills have been tested. LL&S landfill I worked on last year in Salem, that's actually a construction debris, C&D landfill. So it doesn't even have municipal waste. It's largely just ground up wood, brick, and stuff from buildings that have been demoed, stuff that you might throw in a dumpster if you tear down a shed or something and someone comes and hauls it away. That's where it ends up at the landfill, yet they've got very, very high PFAS levels, possibly from Scotch-guarded carpets that came out in the waste stream, maybe from wood. Wood's usually impregnated with something to make it waterproof. You build a new house, it rains, water ponds up on that nice new plywood before the roof goes on, and it just wicks away because it doesn't sink into the wood. Wastewater treatment facilities. You imagine if there's wells that are impacted with PFAS, all that stuff in some of the larger communities is ending up at a wastewater treatment plant. So it kind of becomes a centrally located place for all these PFAS waste to go. Other facilities will then take some of these composted wastes and they'll use them for fertilizer. Dairy farmers in Maine have had trouble with this issue. They've been taking these sludges from wastewater treatment facilities, taking them up, landfilling, or spreading them out on the fields for fertilizer. The grass grows, the cows eat the grass, PFAS ends up in the milk. It's been an issue that's been in the news lately. Then over here you see another common theme: fire training, fire department, fire training, Wyndham Fire Department. I just finished a site investigation for them last week. Some metals, another component. Another place for PFAS to show up is in chrome plating operations. They use it as a mist suppressant to fight the chrome gases that form. It's so many uses for it. So why stratum? So how did this little issue come to the local area? DES had been taking on some statewide sampling that was focused on municipal fire stations. That's actually how Wyndham came up. There was some public water supply wells around fire stations. They thought, well, fire stations use a lot of Class B foams. We've seen it in other instances where there's been impacts to wells around fire stations. Let's start spreading out and taking a look at that. So they sampled a couple public wells in Wyndham, and sure enough, there was elevated concentrations of PFAS, and they said, town, you gotta do a site investigation. Similar situation here, they got some data from a private well on Portsmouth Avenue, nearby the fire station, back March 5th, I think it was, had exceedances of the then ambient groundwater quality standard, so some higher levels. They asked the town if they could sample the fire department well, which they did, and a few others. So that March round, they ended up with 6 wells, including the fire station. April, so every time they get a detection that's above the standard, they step out, they say, okay, we're gonna draw a 500-foot radius around that well. And then we're gonna find all the other wells that are inside that radius, and we wanna go out and test them. And if one of those on the outskirt is above the ambient groundwater quality standard, they draw another 500-foot radius. They keep spreading out until they hopefully get a clean edge. So this process began then, and they ended up collecting, 27 samples, and 11 of those had PFAS detected above the ambient groundwater quality standard at the time. PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, was detected as high as 206 parts per trillion in one of the wells. The well that services the fire station was at 149. So in April, DES did what they did with the other towns. They said, Stratham, we'd like you to conduct a focused site investigation. Try to figure out where this is coming from. And in June of 2019, the town brought us on board to help begin that process. So the purpose was to identify the possible sources of PFAS and identify additional potential receptors. Again, kind of that stepping out process of trying to, I think the town the state came up with a list of about 37 wells within the 500-foot radius of the fire station. They sent invites out or they sent letters to all those property owners saying, we'd like to sample your well. Some people, it was really slow. Some people were just like, what is this? I don't want my water tested. They're going to sell me something or whatever. They don't want it. So a lot of people, it happens, not just here, it happens at a lot of places. You'd be surprised. I call people up all the time. Hey, we're doing an investigation. We'd like to free sample your water and make sure it's healthy. No, well, they hang up. We don't want anything. So, okay, so people are slow to respond. Our scope of work included a sensitive receptor survey. That was, again, to help make sure we were taking a look at all the wells that kind of fell within that radius, helping the state to sample some of those wells. We installed 5 overburden groundwater monitoring wells at the fire station, and by overburden, I mean this is the interval above the bedrock, so that saturated area, beneath the ground surface and above the bedrock surface. The collection of groundwater and drinking water samples, historical review of the fire department operations, kind of the historical processes on that property. And we're going to put all that data into the focused site investigation report, which I'm working on now. It's due September 30th, which, for those of you who remember what the effective date of the new standards is, 9/30, completely unassociated. It was just a random number I came up with before. That effective date came up just for a matter of keeping this thing on track. So no relation to the due date and the date that the new standards go into effect, but we'll have that report into the town by the end of the month in participation in events like this. The field investigation, we kicked it off. We drilled the wells at the end of June. Usually we wait about 2 weeks after those monitoring wells go in before we collect samples. So we did some groundwater sampling. We collected, some drinking water samples in early to mid-July, and then we did a second round of the groundwater samples at the end of July, and the data just came in around the end of August, and so here we are. Okay, so this is the part where I hope we can see this. Good, thank you. So this is the study area here. This is the fire station property here. This is kind of the circle, if you will. This heads up Route 108 towards Newmarket. So the Stratham Country Store or Village Market, I guess it is. It's right across the street. This is an air photo showing the current configuration of the fire station, the Historical Society building, the store across the street, just to get you oriented with the study area. Now, this is a very complicated, it's got a lot of lines on it. I don't mean to overwhelm you, but there are a couple of key things. I don't even know if you can read it at that distance, but this is the fire station here. The well that services the fire station is right here, next to the Historical Society building. Inside the new fire station, an excellent design, by the way. The builders here, I have to be nice to them. Great design. I mean, seriously, the floor drain system here, which is intended to capture any water that comes out of off the trucks, comes out of the hoses, and capture it and stores it in this fully contained 1,500-gallon tank. It's essentially like a septic tank, except it doesn't leach out to a leach field. This tank containerizes all of that water. It has a float switch on it. When it's full, it gets pumped off, so it doesn't go out into a leach field. A similar one exists on this side of the building, which handles decon water. As the firefighters come back in, take off their clothes, there's a decon room in there, there's a shower in there. Again, that water is contained. So you have two ways of containerizing the water that comes off the trucks, off of hoses. The hoses are dried indoors, not outdoors. And that was a common practice back in the day. I mean, you don't want to roll up wet hoses, right? So a lot of times they'd have like these flagpole kind of devices they'd hang hoses on, just let them drip dry outside onto the ground. So, and also there is the leach field for the new fire station is out here. So, so you got, for gray water purposes in the building, for toilets, sinks, et cetera, you have water that's, quite frankly, has PFAS in it. Coming in, it's going through the piping system and out to the septic system and leaching back into the ground. So this is the point where, before I continue, I just want to say a few words about Class B firefighting foams and their use, because they are and have been largely used all over the place because they're effective, not just here in Stratham or here in New Hampshire, but throughout the country and the world. It was a very common practice, and any impacts to the groundwater quality right now are really not attributable to anything wrong that the town or the fire department did historically, and this is what happened. I mean, you just saw PEAS wasn't really even an issue until almost 5 or 6 years ago. We weren't paying attention to this kind of stuff. No one really understood this. So the very common and widely accepted practices was like anything. It was a common practice, and it was not done illegally. So it's important to note this. Stratham did, up until about 2000, use a product called Universal Gold, which has a fluorosurfactant in it. It is a PFAS containing foam, or was, I should say. Well, it still is, but they don't use it anymore. The department has switched, about 2002, they switched over to a product. It's a fluorine-free product called Encapsulator Agent 500. And Chief Larrabee was very helpful, and when I met with him back in June, he and Mr. Crow walked me around the facility and showed me the floor drain system and the way they go about managing all those waters and anything that comes out of those the hoses onto the floor in the fire station. My understanding is that the foam that's on, there's 2 trucks right now for the Stratham Fire Department that have foam on them. They each have about 35 gallons of foam. That foam has been on the trucks since they got it in 2002. It's probably getting near the end of its useful life. They don't use it a lot. So I think Chief Larrabee said you might use it on 1 fire a year in the area. So, the question then becomes, okay, well, if we don't use it and we do a great job in containerizing it, where did it come from? It was probably from historic uses prior to the construction of at least this is my hypothesis, from historic uses and practices prior to the new fire station being built 10 or 15 years ago. The orientation of the old fire station is roughly in this area here. There's a couple of fire bay doors at this end, a couple of fire bay doors at this end. The leach field system for the old fire station was in this area here somewhere. So I designed an approach, a sampling approach, or a monitoring well installation approach to kind of take into consideration both the present configuration of the fire station and the old configuration as well. With the fire bay doors here, in theory, if any kind of foams were released or rinsed out, you know, and I've talked to other fire chiefs who have a similar tank system where the floor drains containerize these foams and waters that come out of the hose and they go out to the tank. And he says, yeah, well, it goes into the tank. And when the tank's full, we have it pumped off. And I said, well, what happens if you have to rinse the hoses and the tank's already full? And he goes, well, then we do it outside. So, I mean, it's possible. I'm not saying it's happened here, and quite frankly, if it has in the past 18 years, it wouldn't matter because it's a fluorine-free foam now. But for the purpose of designing a site investigation, we installed one monitoring well here. Groundwater flow in this area goes to the west, northwest, towards the river. So kind of from this side of the page off to that direction. So this well, you can't see it, but it says MW 101. This was our up gradient monitoring well. So this is kind of the sentinel point that's going to look. If there's anything up here that's moving onto the fire station property, we would pick it up here. With the configuration of the old fire station and the area where the trucks pull in and out in the new fire station, we installed a couple of monitor wells here. This is MW 102 and MW 105. These would be potentially, you'd expect some impacts there because of if there was PFAS in the septic system, or if it was disposed on the ground out here, you might see it there. And then a couple more wells out here as groundwater's moving off the site. We want to be able to, you know, we want to know what the concentrations are leaving the site and heading towards these residences and businesses across the street.
Could you explain what you mean by when the tank is full, it's pumped off to where?
Right, a company comes and removes it. They pump out like a septic company would come, like they would pump out your leach
Do you know
field.
where they take it?
We do know where they take it. No, they don't take it to the, no, it leaves the city, the town, I should say. What do they do with it? They take it to a receiving facility. I know a lot of them, even some of the local ones, might eventually end up at like Greater Lawrence Sanitary District. I don't know if that's where this one goes, but it does end up at some large wastewater treatment facilities. And we mentioned one of the wastewater treatment facilities earlier in the sites that the DES is managing right now. It all goes somewhere, so. Nope, that stuff doesn't break down, so that's why a wastewater treatment facility or something like that is, you know, that's why they become targets for the state to look at, because, you know, it's a place where all those fluids are concentrating. They store it, or they might treat it. So, I mean, you can treat PFAS, and as they, you know, I can't attest to what every waste receiving facility does. But in general, you can treat the stuff with, you can filter it out with a carbon-based vessel system, or there's also a synthetic resin product that is used like a carbon. And it will filter that out, but then you have contaminated media. You have contaminated carbon or these resin compounds. And usually the only way to get rid of that is to cook it at a very, very high temperature. And so that's another process they're working on now, where they essentially boil it and then they heat up the vapor and burn it off, in theory. It is it's a problem. No.
Where does it come from in the first place? I mean,
Where does the what?
companies make this stuff?
Yes, they make it, yeah.
Chemically engineered?
Yeah, they make it, and back in 2002-ish, they started backing off on the production of PFOA because it was becoming a problem. You know, but these scientists said, well, I like the product and it really works and we need something else, so we'll modify it. And they produce what we call replacement chemistries. They come up with a slight little tweak to the compound, to the structure, the molecular structure of it, and they say, okay, it's not PFOA anymore, it's something slightly different. And now they have products called Gen X is one, Adana is another one. So they just kind of tweak the formula a little bit and they make a different product and say, well, it's not that. Yeah, we're moving away from that, so we created this. This is different. But that, we're starting to study now, and we find it, and it breaks down into the product they originally had designed. So it's a challenge, a real challenge.
So I'm sure we understand this. So you're saying for instance,
Sure.
our foam that's used today, we don't know whether it's good or bad.
The foam the town uses now is a fluorine-free foam.
Okay.
So that's a good thing. It's a different, a different surfactant. It's not an AFFF foam, a Class B foam that has fluorinated compounds in it.
That problem, we're not continuing to add to the problem, even though we have safer procedures here as well.
Sure, yes. Yeah, the town was, yep.
Jim, just to make clear for the question, while we are not utilizing fluorinated foams at the site anymore and haven't for almost 2 decades, the fact of these products being in the Scotch guards, the wrappers,
Yes.
all of the non-stick related products, those continue to be fabricated,
Yep.
continue to be utilized and then discarded.
Yep.
So I think the observation that our wastewater from anywhere that contains water that came up from the ground with PFAS in it and went into a septic field and was pumped out of a tank, it goes somewhere. Just today, one of those facilities that accepts those closed for business because the state precluded them from accepting that waste in that manner. So it's a very important concept for what we're all facing here as a nation, really, and hyper locally here, that we benefit from these products that add conveniences, but they do not go away as we would like them to go. So so that brings us back to the results we're finding as a result of the preliminary investigation.
Yeah, sure. So this is, these blue lines and arrows, these are the potentiometric contours, essentially the contours of the groundwater, of the subsurface groundwater table, in the direction of groundwater flow. So with groundwater moving, I'm gonna try not to step away from the mic, with the groundwater flowing here off to the west-northwest, if there were PFAS in the subsurface around the fire station, you would expect MW 101 here, the upgradient one, to be relatively clean. These 2 wells, 2 and 5, to have higher levels of contamination, and then probably lower levels here as you move away from the potential source. And again, same situation across the street. And this is what we found. I really hope you can see that. So MW 101 had just a lot of non-detects. These report just the 4 compounds that are regulated by the state now. So there were non-detect compounds, or just really some trace single-digit numbers in the upgradient well. And if you look at MW 102 and MW 105, the second round, what was that one? 1900 or 1300? I can't even read it. That's it was 24. There was 2,400 parts per trillion in the first round. I think it went down to 19. I think that says 13 there. 870 the first time. So. Thank you. Of course. Did you bring my glasses too? Yeah, I think that was. Actually, let me check. So, hey, I just became a grandfather last week, so my eyes are about that age. So yeah, elevated levels here in MW 102 and 105. And then as we move to 3 and 4, kind of at the edge of the property, it's still high, triple-digit numbers. And then the store across the street allowed us to test some of the wells that they have in the ground for their petroleum release, and the levels went down to double digits. So it's definitely, it's the highest around this area, and the concentrations go down as you move away from the site. So. I don't know. I mean, groundwater flow depends on a number of factors. The sorting of the materials. Is it really sandy? Is it a glacial till? Is it very tight? You're talking about in overburden or groundwater. I would have to look at the value. I don't know. I haven't tested them.
Who owns under the mountain? That's stone, or do the individual property owners actually have mineral
So the state considers all groundwaters of the state to belong to the state. So they actually consider it a third party in terms of insurance. If there's a release, you usually have, first and third party claims in your insurance, and the groundwater is the third. The groundwater is its own party. It's a third party impact.
Two questions. The overburden well, would that be similar to a bedrock well as far as the amount of contamination, or potentially less contamination than a bedrock well? I have two.
Right, so the overburden is, it's essentially like a dug well, right? So it's just in the sand below the ground surface. Once groundwater migrates through that overburden, it gets down into cracks in the bedrock surface. It gets down to, and that fractured flow is very anisotropic, I'm not even gonna try to say it, thank you. It goes in a lot of different directions, so it's not a very linear situation once you get down to the cracks in bedrock. So it can travel in a lot of different directions once it gets into bedrock, but it's usually, oftentimes, controlled by pumping wells. So if you have, water supply wells that are putting a stress on that local aquifer, it might be drawing it in, so.
So those wells that are highly contaminated shut down then?
These ones here are just overburden monitoring wells, so,
I just want to just make clear the difference between a drinking water well that someone might have at home
yeah,
and the wells you're talking about on the screen, which are the monitoring wells.
exactly, yes.
Which are 20-foot, about 20-foot depths.
Yep.
Dug for solely the purpose of monitoring the groundwater at the site.
Yep.
So these wells are not drinking water wells. They are monitoring wells for the purposes of this site investigation.
These are just 2-inch round PVC wells that have a screen on them. And we usually screen them about 7 feet past the water table so that we can catch the water table as it fluctuates. It's all within that well screen. It's a 10-foot screen.
So Jim,
Yep.
earlier you provide some information about the initial PFAS results from the drinking water wells in the vicinity, and we saw them range from, they're in the hundreds and in the early 200s.
Yes.
And those wells, it's fair to assume, it's the case, that those are deeper wells,
Yep.
hundreds of feet down.
Yes.
And whereas these monitoring wells at the high end of our site, which are non-detect for these contaminants, but as we move further down the site, we see numbers in the thousands. Those are detections of PFAS within 20 feet of
Yeah. Just below the ground surface, where in theory there were more recent releases.
Which happens to be where the well is at the fire department at the 2400 site. Right between the historic, coming down to the historic
Yep,
society.
right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's right at the 2400, the worst one.
Well, so, yeah, about, 15 feet below the ground surface or so, 15 to 20 feet, it was at, 2400. In bedrock here, I don't know how deep this well is, it could be 400 feet deep. And it might have a water-bearing fracture that only is from, between 350 and 400 feet, say. I mean, it may not be very highly fractured. The water that's coming into that open borehole could be from a very deep depth. So there's perhaps not a lot of communication between this overburden and that bedrock. So we do have a look at the bedrock groundwater data. So again, groundwater flow moving off to the west. So what this represents, the red dots these are all the drinking water wells with PFAS in them at the newly revised MCLs. So anything that's over an MCL is a red dot. The yellow dots mean that PFAS was detected, but not above those standards. In green, they were tested and they were non-detect. So you can see there are no wells, drinking water wells in this area directly up gradient, but the ones here off to the side in this neighborhood were either non-detect or very low detect. Then you get to the fire station, and then you get concentrations of 149, 200, 206, and then they continue off in that direction. These are single or actually double-digit PPT concentrations.
And Jim, can you
Yeah.
clarify that this map is utilizing the October 1st levels, or is it the levels prior to October 1st?
You mean these represent the currently adopted standards, the lower standards. The results are from the most recent sampling event. Some of them might be, well, samples that we collected as part of our investigation. Some may be samples that DES collected as part of theirs. So they were collected at different times, but these would represent the most recent at that location.
Do you know when this is from? When this was created? Because I live across the street from the group of 4 dots, and
This one?
higher than, what is it, MC?
Which group of 4 dots?
Yeah, those 4 dots.
In here?
Yeah, we're across the street from that.
So we just collected 2 College Road, which I think is the post office. That's very recent. That one was just done during the first event in mid-July. DES has not, a lot of the data DES collected is back from March, April timeframe. A few of these are from the samples that we collected in July. So I know DES is now looking at, they're projecting out another 500-foot radius, and they're going to look for folks like you who have a well within that radius to continue the program. So, yes, sir.
So for a number of, you mentioned the scratch guard, for a number of years, a projection was to across from the fire department, there was a dry cleaners.
Yep.
Do dry cleaners use anything in that process as well, to clean the groundwater, or?
They use chlorinated solvents as a cleaning agent. I haven't seen direct links between laundromats and dry clean facilities and PFAS, but it's turning up in more and more places. Like I mentioned, they weren't looking for it at gas station sites. Then they started looking at car washes. They'll probably start looking at the ski industry from all the ski wax that ends up on snow that melts and goes into rivers and ponds. It's possible if there was discharges, let's say they have a Scotch-guarded product that they dry clean, or a product that has PFAS in it. It could be, whether it's a dry cleaner or a laundromat, that could apply. Yes, sir.
What's the lowest depth the material has been discovered?
The lowest depth below the ground surface? I can't answer that here or in general.
In the area?
I guess the answer to that is whatever the deepest well is, and I don't know. I guess we would have to look at that as a depth below ambient, mean sea level. But, if a well is 500 feet deep, the water that's entering that could be at a fracture that's, half that depth, so it's difficult to say.
So I can't read the legend to your
Yeah.
map, but I'm assuming that the yellow dots are non-zero concentrations?
Yes, non-zero, so
They are
below,
non-zero.
they're below the current maximum contaminant levels,
Yeah,
but they are there.
but it's quite interesting. If they are distributed in whatever direction that is, north,
Yep.
west, or something, northeast.
Yep.
Did the stuff get that way by surface flow, or would these have been subsurface flow, or these household goods that you mentioned in your houses?
It could be a combination of factors. A factor that we've looked at in the past is we look at bedrock lineament maps. A lineament map is their high-altitude photos that look for patterns on the ground surface, and those patterns can be, sometimes, you get faked out by a fence line, but a lot of times there's a feature that represents a major fracture orientation in the ground surface. And, it could be that I'm saying we haven't done any testing to confirm it. There could be a fracture that runs through this area, so the contaminants get into that fracture zone and they run along that preferred flow pathway. In general, though, I believe this neighborhood has its own water supply well up here somewhere, so some of these residences don't have dots because that all comes from one well that's off the site. So these would be other individual wells. But, the point being, they're not as affected as the ones down gradient of the fire station.
Just another,
Hold on one sec.
Do you have any more slides or are we officially moving on?
Just a few more slides. Okay.
I was wondering about the groundwater flow, does it stop when it reaches the stream that goes along?
Yeah, so Squamscott River is a regional groundwater discharge point. So eventually, water flows to those points and then out to the ocean. So that's why when I mentioned in Merrimack, it was kind of, how is this getting on the other side of the Merrimack River? That's really a large groundwater discharge point. How is it getting under the river and to the other side? It was because of the atmospheric deposition. Okay, so I said I wanted to touch on the landfill. So the landfill on Union Road, the town, like many others, got the request to include PFAS testing in their standard monitoring program. So in 2018, they included one monitoring well on the property. I believe it was kind of in the center of the landfill or just down gradient, and 2 homeowner wells. PFOA and PFOS were detected above the ambient groundwater quality standard at the time. And PFH excess was there. It would be above the current one now, but it wasn't in play last year. But the homeowner wells, there were no detections, not even trace levels that were non-detect in the homeowner wells adjacent to the landfill. A similar round was done a year later, included 4 monitoring wells on the property, the same 2 homeowner wells plus an additional one, and very similar results. All 3 of those PFAS compounds were detected above AGQS in 2 of the 4 wells, and again, no detections in the homeowner wells.
The homeowner wells on Union?
On Union, I believe, yes, right. Yep. So the question then is, and some of you have been asking it already, what's next? What do we do with this? The DES will review the focus site investigation report over probably in October, and I would say issue some kind of response to the town with possibly some recommendations about what they want to do. I can all but guarantee it will include additional drinking water testing. They'll at least want additional testing done. The town is, when we get results that indicate there's an exceedance of an MCL, we let the town know, or the DES tells us about it, we let the town know, and the town is providing bottled water to those property owners. We will likely, as I said, continue water supply well testing. What DES has proposed is what they call the 4 quarters rule. And so by that, they would institute quarterly drinking water sampling, and they would average the results over those 4. And if the average of those 4 exceeds the MCL, then they would probably implement some kind of a treatment system on the well, a full-time treatment system, or some other way of providing clean water. So if let's say you're looking at PFOS with a standard, an MCL of 15 parts per trillion, if you came out of the gate first sample, you had 61 parts per trillion, by average you're already over. So that's high. If you got 0 the next 3 times, you'd still be over on the average. But if you were slightly over on 1 and then under on the next 3, they'd consider you under the MCL. That's what they proposed. They've presented that at a couple of conferences. There's nothing to my knowledge that's formal and written on their website about that. They will always be continuing to evaluate long-term solutions. Right now, a point-of-entry treatment system is really the popular and really the best and only way to go about providing treatment of a water supply system. And you could drink bottled water, but to treat it at the source, you'd use these point-of-entry treatment systems, these carbon vessels or synthetic resin vessels to treat the system like what's out at Pease for the town of Portsmouth, city of Portsmouth. Another option is to develop a standalone water supply system. So find a clean property in the area, put a water supply well in, kind of like a community well, and then run clean water to, as many tie-ins as you need to pick up those affected residents. Yes?
That 4-quarter rule has actually been amended. It's
Okay.
now a 2-quarter rule.
Oh, it is?
Yep. And if you get 2 NDs, you can ask for a waiver for the next 2, which saves you $200 for thereabouts. And then you want to try anything.
I'll have to get your card. Thank you.
Now backed off from the 4 quarters to now 2.
Okay, interesting. That's good. There's so much information coming out on a daily basis. It's a very dynamic situation.
They have to be consecutive.
Yeah, gotcha. or a municipal water line extension similar to the standalone supply, like what they're doing in Merrimack, just running a new water line down and tying everyone in. Many communities are having the same discussion. This is not a unique discussion. What's happening here tonight, it's happening in a lot of communities across the state. An option, a long-term solution, the way that some of these things are funded is through the Groundwater Drinking Water Trust Fund. That is a very large sum of money that came into the state from the state's lawsuit against the petroleum manufacturers 10 or 15, maybe 20 years ago now. The first round of the court settlement brought in about $135 million to the state, and about 50 of that went to the lawyers, and the state remained with about 80 million of that, and that's what they've been using now, but that's specifically for MTBE-related projects. ExxonMobil fought the finding, and it went up to the Supreme Court. They fought it for about 10 years and finally lost about 2 years ago now. And with all the interest that compounded over that time period, the state took in about another $240 million, I think, just from ExxonMobil alone. The state was very good about writing the law about how that money would be used. It's not tied specifically to a gasoline-related issue, so it's really available in the form of grants to communities to help, come up with solutions to help educate people about it. And so that, combined with continued best management practices like what the Stratham Fire Department practices with respect to firefighting foams, they always want to advance that discussion. And they're still going to consider soil, they'll consider soil, they might consider soil sampling here. They could say, well, we want to go out and test around that leach field and see how much PFAS is in the soil. But that's really, what do you do with that data? Because there's nothing to evaluate it against. There's nothing that says, well, this is too much, and this will cause a problem in groundwater. But the state's going to continue to look at coming up with a soil remediation standard for that, yes.
So, as far as our situation with the municipal landfill, back in the 80s, we were part of a waste district, part of the first fast energy facility in the country, it was up at the University of New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And at one point, we wanted to have Barrington, and they said, no, they wouldn't take it, they were going to shut down. So the town of Stratham decided they wouldn't take it for some time, and for a while, I got out of the land, but eventually, a portion of it was taken away, some name. And as I think the other town's responsibility of the remediation system has to be put in the paper part of that.
I'd say it's unclear how they're, I mean, this is similar to the larger question about the wastewater treatment issue. What do you do? I mean, how many times do you start pointing the fingers? I mean, every septic company's coming and pumping out water, and they're taking it with somewhere, and they're taking, they're amalgamating it all from their vendors, and they're taking it to a larger facility. When is enough? When do you say enough is enough? Are they gonna is someone gonna point the finger at the town of Stratham because part of their landfill is now at this town?
Well, that's what happened at Colton,
Yeah.
pretty wide now.
Right.
But I did wonder about that. And these were towns who we were taking, residents
Yeah.
after municipalities.
had a brief concept that I think is out there that, with the Coakley example, the contributors of waste over the years are assigned at the time when the Superfund decision is brought.
That there's a certain percentage that the different communities are responsible for. That would be the case for the town of Stratham for the landfill that you're talking about that I believe is operated as part of the cooperative. So that logic follows. You added an initial wrinkle, which is the landfill the landfill incinerated waste that is made to be ash and then distributed to half other landfills is happening very soon. Whether that sets up another layer of drawing the lines of responsibility. I don't know the answer to that question, but the concept plays out that you could draw the lines, and I think what Jim has mentioned is, where do you stop and how complex does this get? And doesn't it really just underline that we are all in this together to some degree or another? Right. But I do recall in Strathmore, instead of attacking, it was emergency situations. It was just running in giant loads and put it right on the ground like that.
Galleries or anything. So it's an unusual situation that took place as well, and then when they removed some, they just removed what they could, and that was kind of it. But now that this has come up, it kind of adds that other wrinkle to it. Good explanation.
Well, an important consideration of all that is that at the time that was done, it wasn't illegal. You know, when you get some of these Superfund sites, there was a lot of midnight dumping that was going on. I mean, they were taking drums of chemicals and they were dumping them illegally in some of these landfills. I mean, the process of simply putting trash in a landfill that 20 years later we discovered now had some PFAS constituents to it wasn't an illegal act. So what's the liability?
I will say, in this case, though, there was a procedure. Barrington didn't want it anymore, so Stratham did not follow any of the procedures. It was an emergency situation, so they said, we will take it, and that's kind of what happened.
Yeah.
There was no barrier.
Right. Yep.
So you made a comment, where do you stop, right? Like, where do you stop pointing the finger? Where are we gonna start in this town, in our community? Forget about everything else at the second. All those red dots in our community
Yep.
that's costing a lot, actually. Where are we gonna start? I know your investigation ends in a couple of weeks, but what does that actually mean? You're saying the state has money, have they already agreed to release money to install these expensive carbon filters and all this testing and
Yep.
system, just monitoring? I mean, it's costly. And if, I feel that if I own the surface and I don't own the bottom, why should I have to be paying for that water?
Right.
So how do we go to the next step?
That's a good question, and one I'd probably ask myself. I'm not the decision maker in that. I will tell you, in other communities, they're looking for the responsible party to, pay for the treatment systems.
That's my understanding, that's the current ruling anyway.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And with your question about the funding, I mean, they do have a lot of money, and they are taking a lot of applications for, I think they had 32 applications approved the first year to.
For communities, not individuals.
Communities, yep. I think they released about, I can't remember the number, several tens of millions of dollars the first time, but it's in the form of a grant. It's not a handout.
This would be Stratum's problem.
Exactly. The question was, and I'm going to start repeating the questions for the sake of the videography. The question was, where do we begin, how do we get the leads financially of mitigating this contamination?
Health is obviously the first concern, but I guarantee no one in this room thinks that
Right.
really doesn't matter.
I think there's concerns of individual homeowners and property owners, and of the town as a whole. When you consider the potential role in the original contamination. So the answer to your question is, we're just beginning to have enough information in order to begin those conversations about how it plays out. And Jim could mention a number of other approaches that have been applied or begun where potentially responsible parties have voluntarily complied and done pump and treat systems or installed whole new technologies, in the case of the Air Force FPs, or did point of entry systems and handled it that way. We need to find the facts about the situation in our particular site. That's part of this investigation. We need to report those out to the state and to the regulator and participate in those conversations about what's next. They've signed off on our original methodology for our study. Do the data that we present cause them to ask for additional process, additional investigation, additional strategies to narrow down on certain questions? That could be part of this. are going to get to a point of what's the mitigation approach, and there, and responsibilities will be meted out, decisions will be made, and actions will need to be taken. But to go any further than that would just be speculation right now on where that ends up. But that's why we're making this a significant presentation tonight, taking a significant amount of your time. This is a potentially very large issue that the town may be facing, the extent of which is not limited to just our fire station, but landfills, plural. And if you broaden out, many other communities in New Hampshire are in the same boat. So we're going to be dealing with this for some time to come, I think it's fair to say.
So you had talked a couple years ago about bringing that public water system all the way into the town center, correct? Has that just been rushed until recently?
Not at all, not at all. So
I've always been there.
there's some chuckling. The chuckling is not because your question is a good one, but because it's been a topic of discussion
Oh, I'm sure.
for some
Yeah.
4 decades here in town, I understand.
Yeah, I know it has been, but that's like, I'm wondering if you've already been thinking of it, just, I mean, this is just the account money coming out. It's already been in the process, it's already been in the thinking, there should already be some funding there to help start getting something going. And I know this is so fast, this has been.
I'm voted down.
Huh?
I'm voted municipal water down.
So we don't want to not
Yeah.
finish the presentation, which I think you probably have 45 seconds left, and then take more questions. However, it would be an understatement to say that there's a significant number of people in town who are, and this is being reflected in the master plan that's been drafted, a recommitment to the vision of that gateway corridor. That is the place where, through various actions of the town over the years, the town has said that's where we want to concentrate commercial development. So that is the place where we have and it is easiest to introduce a municipal water and sewer system in order to promote the types of densities that will provide the types of services that people are interested in, the amenity upgrades, and the housing diversity that we have the opportunity to achieve in that corridor. So those are very active discussions. The select board is very interested in continuing those. Now, I have to say, the option for extending water to the town of Stratton comes from the border of Exeter, not the middle of town at the town center. So there's a long stretch to get to that portion. But you raised an important issue. Central treatment of water through a freshly managed distribution system is the way to protect against the next PFAS issue that comes up. That is the system that is the most resilient and has the ability to provide the most relief in the situation.
You know, I live in Portsmouth, actually, I'm here representing, sorry. And I live in Portsmouth, and I was at a meeting once, she just fell into this about 18 months ago, some parent had brought it up, and I was there for like the groceries, or something, I had no clue this was even anything, even living there, even having town water, I still never said anything. The closing documents and the purchase agreement, nobody said anything, and so this blows my mind. I'm sure it blows everybody's mind, but am I incorrect by saying that the carbon filters are ultimately the saving grace for the time being on the point of where the water actually comes out of the ground and goes into the building and something, correct?
Yeah, they're very effective.
Very effective. Are they effective enough to bring these super high levels down to these new super low carbon?
That is a good question now that these are in place.
That seems
Yep,
frustrating.
yeah, sure. I mean, people want 0, you know? They don't care if the standard is 15.
I'd like
You
to have
tell your toddler to drink 14, you know?
absolutely use bottled water.
Right, right. Which, by the way, a plant just got shut down in Haverhill last month because they tested the water at the, I think it was Spring Hill. It was the bottled water.
Oh, great.
And
So,
it,
Jim, do you want to just apply for your last slide
Yeah.
here?
this is my last slide. So, yeah, part of the solution, you know, the state is very proactive in attacking this issue. In May, the state announced its lawsuit against the PFAS manufacturers for that, to recover monies that would be used to investigate and clean up these issues. So that's another potential source of income into the state. Just last week, the governor signed a bill to ban, two bills, to ban PFAS, one in firefighting foams and two on applied products on furniture, like the Scotchgard type of application. So he's banned those. I just had to slip this one in because this just came out. Denmark banned PFAS in all food packaging. So, you know, it's a global issue, and things are happening all the time. New information is coming out all the time. The state is going to look to implement surface water standards. They don't have surface water standards right now. They were targeting January of 2020 for that. The soil standard issue is still out there. That's something we'll continue to work towards. And the state has hired, they continue to evaluate health risks. They hired a toxicologist to help with the problem as well. They brought that person onto the staff to help evaluate the exposure to human health. So that is it. This is my big question mark. Thank you for your attention. We did go over an hour. I hope it wasn't too dry or too boring. It was informative, and I'll stay as long as.
So we're gonna go through a Q&A right now. Would ask just to raise your hand, and I'll repeat the question if you'll bear with us on the video. And sir, go ahead in the back.
When the term community is used with respect to obtaining funds from this trust fund or applying for them, does that only mean municipalities, or could like we live in, we have 3 community wells, we have 60 homes, and so I wonder if there's been a definition attached to that word community in this instance.
Well, so my response to that would be, we do not know exactly. I think you've got to start with who's going to bear the costs of mitigation. There are scenarios where there's a responsible party who's going to be made to mitigate, clean up, install those filters, or fund a direct dedicated water supply line. In that case, a community actor or a business who's incurring those costs. I'm not sure if you're talking about a community member's or an individual's own elective decision to incur costs to install a carbon filter proactively without that process running out. If someone selects to do that, I would keep the receipts and document, but no one will be able to tell you what the mechanisms are to reimburse you.
Well, that's what I know that we've talked in our community, we've talked about being proactive, getting the carbon filters installed, and of course I know we'll keep every well.
Go ahead, sir.
So ultimately, I guess we're concerned about human health. You mentioned the half-life of 2 years to 9 years. Could it be that most of what's accumulating in the human body is actually from these household goods like food packaging that you mentioned, and not the water?
So the question is, how much of the contamination that humans have in their bodies would be resulting from contaminated drinking water or commercial goods?
Yep, it could be from flipping pancakes on your Teflon frying pan. That could be a way, sure. PFAS isn't like, I want to mention this, it's not like mercury that accumulates in your body and never goes away. I mean, every little incremental bit you get over the course of your lifetime just adds on, it doesn't go away. PFAS will excrete from the system in that time frame, so. Sir.
Representative Abrami?
So, there's good news and bad news here. Bad news is the Stratton's affected, but a lot of towns affected. If it's just Stratton, when it comes to money flowing from Concord to help mitigate, it'll be a tougher haul. So the bad news is that it's involved in so many communities, and we're finding, like I said, more and more every day, we're finding, doing a lot more testing, especially at the fire station.
Yep.
So, right now, there is this big chunk of money out there, it's a lot of money. This budget, $6 million, is been appropriated. Problem is, the budget's in the government moment, but that money will be released to go to the Department of Environmental Services for continued
Right, I will say with the Groundwater Drinking Water Trust Fund, it is not, it's not a handout, it is a loan. When it came out, my understanding was they were first looking for municipalities, if it was a municipality that wanted the money, to go through the revolving loan fund first. And if that wasn't an option, or if they had already been through it and exhausted the funds they could get from it, then you could apply for funding under the Groundwater Drinking Water Trust Fund. But you had to pony up about $3 for every dollar you wanted to get out of the fund. So it was not something that, water line extensions can cost, rule of thumb is $1 million a mile. So if you gotta run a water line 10 miles up the road, it's a $10 million project, that means you gotta come up with, about 6-7 million of your own to get, the other 3 million from the fund, so.
Where's the actual proof of human damage? I mean, where's the result? I don't see any actual studies that show this actual, especially in small amounts. Heat, I understand, but like a child, you get a much smaller amount. Where's the proof that it really is damage being done?
So the question is about the extent of evidence scientifically about the harm to human health.
Right, and as I mentioned, the testing that is done, like on a lot of things, is it's lab testing on animals. So they try to extrapolate the impacts to the lab animals to human health. It's relatively new, to your point, with testing on humans. Portsmouth did recently they had some funding available for the people around Pease, and they did, you could walk in, I think you can get a blood test, and they would test it, and they would show the elevated concentrations that were in the blood. So they know it's getting there.
I know, but I gotta believe in our water, there's far more substances in this that could be proven to
Sure.
not be good. I mean, water is gonna, every time it rains, everything washes off the roads into the well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's gotta be all kinds of chemicals in water that, if you individually test them, are potentially cancer-causing.
Yep.
And we've been drinking that water for, decades, hundreds of years or whatever.
Yep.
But isn't a lot of this possibly about money? And potential lawsuits to bring in money? I mean, I'm just wondering. I'm not sure, but I'm asking.
Yep.
I mean,
So you are not the first one to ask in good faith about what the true detrimental effects are of these chemicals. And I think a lot of people share those concerns about what is the next thing we don't know about, and what does that mean, and how are we going to react. I think one of the philosophies around prioritizing extending water supply lines from centrally treated systems like a municipal water system is that you can adjust over time and put the better product through the pipes, and as opposed to what we are facing now with scattered water supply by property. So it's a good question. I think it's a fair question. We've gone through a process in the state of New Hampshire recently where these new levels that will be in place after October 1st went through a rulemaking process where people challenged that science and challenged the risk. And what we ended up with is the lower levels and the new standards. So those questions you're asking are playing out through the political process, and we are here to work through the rules of the game. Mr. Moisen?
What's the cost of the company for testing for PFAS?
On a per sample basis, or like if you just said, Wilcox and Barton, can you come out and test my well? In that?
No, let's say the samples were brought to you.
So we send them to a lab. The lab charges us $275 a sample, in general.
So if you
Depending on
you could order samples yourself from the lab and pay directly without any
Yeah.
period. What we are engaged in here is a site investigation with a number of tests being collected and analyzed, and that's part of our engagement with Wilcox and Barton. But you could
pay for these private testing outfits to, it's expensive, as Jim
Yeah,
indicated.
they tend to run between $250 and $300, depending on where you go. And what analyte list you want, that makes a difference too.
Other questions? How about Peter in there?
So the focus seems to be on the fire department.
Yeah.
Is there any thought to perhaps an additional source of the contamination in our new plans? In terms of putting additional testing, monitoring, and all that?
So the question is, Town Center, the fire department does not make up Town Center solely by itself. There are other actors over time in it. What are we doing to further substantiate any single point of contamination?
All right, I'm just trying to get back to the slide here. So I'm not even sure this is of any value if you can't read them back there. But so a couple of the slides, actually I think this one kind of tells part of the story. I mean, there does not appear to be, if there was another upgrading source, you'd see more red dots up in here. The fact that you don't see any, and then you see it, you see relatively high levels. Even on the site itself, it went from a 4-digit number to a 3-digit number to a 2-digit number, and then out, again, double digits out there. Would suggest that this is a source area. Is there another area? There could be. I mean, it's such a popular product. In theory, I'm not saying this happened, in theory, there could be, maybe, I don't hope it's no one's property. This guy or this guy here could have some on their property, and it could be contributing. I'm taking a look at the large scale issue. I mean, this is certainly a source area. And probably from something that happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years
And
ago.
the half-life shelf life is gone when it happened, so why is it testing now?
It's still in the ground, and it's being pumped out of the bedrock into the overburden in the septic system, which is recharging back into the ground surface.
So that half-life,
Half-life is not a degradation of the product itself. The half-life refers to how long half of it remains in your body before it excretes out. So it's not a degradation of it, it's a removal from the body.
So, Ms. Mesmer?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer one of the questions that was earlier. I'm a former resident of Mesmer, I do a lot of sort of estate and scientist. Most of the exposure that you get, we think, is related to ingestion of water versus day-to-day exposure from food products and things. It's a much lower level nationally from just the day-to-day exposures, but when you're exposed to water that's contaminated, it does tend to build up your body, have a higher body weight.
Would you be able to explain that just a little bit further as far as showering, water goes into your body and you're showering?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of information yet. There are some NIH scientists who are saying now that you may get exposure through skin absorption, but it's not, the science is not there yet.
And it's
Okay.
not, it doesn't volatilize like an organic compound does, so.
Next new question from someone new, sir?
Yeah, our question is, what do we do with bulk drinking water at this point right now? I mean, I saw something about the town of Stratham's gonna supply drinking water.
Right.
Is
So,
it- How do we go about that?
The question is,
I have a follow-up.
for those of us impacted with PFAS contamination, what are we doing about water now? So the town of Stratham, after it was alerted by DES of the exceedances in the vicinity of town center, was asked to provide drinking water immediately to the people in the surrounding affected with over the 70 parts per trillion. And we, the town, did that immediately upon request of DES and have continued to do that. So far, the town has spent since late April, early May, has spent about $3,000 on drinking water from the state's contractor for drinking water. And as we have become aware of additional properties, either tested through the state or through our study, where the exceedances are over now the new levels, we are providing drinking water to those as they as we become aware of them. You had a follow-up?
Yes. About 20 years ago, I'm in Country Floor, I'm in the circuit, and about 20 years ago, was before O'Brien, they had a gas spill there. Now, that gas spill rolled all downhill, and the state of New Hampshire had found that our well has already been too low. Monadnock has been supplying the water. We get it all the time from the state. I always have to fill out a form. I don't know if that thing, 20 years, was every time we have it tested, it could be a different issue, what you guys are talking about now. But I don't know if that thing has ever gone down because of that gas spill, which is back in 2000.
They did remediate,
Yeah.
or they've been monitoring it through that groundwater.
You're
whatever
familiar
fund.
with this situation?
I am, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and the woman who's been running it, she constantly is contacting me and telling me.
Well, the state had supplied our water, and it's still out to this day, and I'm not,
Yeah.
if they're gonna continue doing it, it's double dipping, I don't care about that. But I have people come in my store, and I wanna make sure they get the, they get the right water. So, but just so many years that thing has happened,
Yeah.
and the state still hasn't signed off on that. So I don't know where the issue is, of whether from the PFAS or from the water from the gas spill back years ago before O'Brien General Store was there. There's a double dip there, so.
Yeah.
And I think Brad could verify that also.
I was concerned about that too, but they did tell me they're two completely different chemicals, so the makeup of one has a different effect on your body than the other.
Yeah.
And that's one chemical is used to clean them out. This is something different.
And, thank you. Next question?
You said the town's already spent about $3,000 on water.
Right.
One house affected. What's the cost for one of the filtration systems for a single-family home?
Jim?
Well, seems like this is always an answer that I end up giving. It depends. It depends on the flow rate, the capacity of your pump, how often you use the water. I've seen POE systems that are $5,000 range. I've seen them go into elementary schools for $20,000 because the need is higher. So.
I'm sorry, I have
So that question was about how much do a point of entry system cost for a residence. Next, any other questions? Sir.
So you said all those dots were all drinking water wells?
Yes.
Okay, and so my question is, the follow-up is, are we gonna do any more testing around the Union Road landfill? Is that done now, the drinking water wells were zero, but not the groundwater one? And are we only testing toward the red edge and the yellow dots, even though they're present and it's low? We're done testing, that's your green edge, that edge is over?
Okay.
So two questions there.
Yeah.
Are we going to continue to test homeowner wells around the landfill? And are we going to, what does the data tell us about the additional testing that will be required on this in-town center?
Right, so I'll try to answer the landfill question. It's not our project. It's not something I communicate with the DES directly on. My guess would be that they'll continue to monitor those two monitoring wells that have had elevated detections. They may go to, they're only doing it annually now. They will probably, if there's elevated levels in the monitoring wells, they will probably continue to monitor the adjacent wells. And I'm guessing the reason there's only been 2 or 3, I don't know the area, but I'm guessing their abutters, direct abutters, are very close. Second question, so I mentioned as the new data comes in, DES is, they're gonna pick this point, and they're gonna cast a 500-foot radius around it. They're gonna find this one, they're gonna do a 500-foot radius. And they do what we call a sensitive receptor survey. We'll look for drinking water wells within that area and they'll send out letters saying, letters will go out saying we'd like to collect a sample of the drinking water.
So if I may, the determination about where additional testing will take place as part of this study will be done at the direction and coordination with DES. And so we can't say that now. We don't know what they will require after we complete our site investigation. Next question?
I'd like to throw the Brad's point, because 20%
water, do we shower with bottled water? What do we have to do here? Is this really what,
So question is,
something we're supposed to be panicked about?
echoing the concern about whether there's an actual risk to human health here is the first part of that question, and do we have to shower with bottled water? That's not the guidance we received from the state. The state is fine with us showering with water that exceeds the levels we've been talking about today. I can only refer you to my earlier response about the judgments being made about the risk to human health and how in our society, in the state of New Hampshire, we are going to respond has played itself out through the regulatory process and rule setting, and people will continue to have those concerns. Where we are now is implementing what the regulatory regime that's been put in place by our government.
So it's kind of like when we buy a house, we have to say radon, we have to say arsenic, now we have to say PCB.
I suspect rules like that may be coming. As you can tell, there's a lot of things where we're pulling a string on a garment here,
Yeah.
and things keep falling apart. Next question. Peter.
Are there technologies available to remove these from the ground? And is there a certain threshold at which those technologies, if they exist, are put into play?
A question about the technology available to remove the contaminants.
The short answer is not yet. They pump them out and they filter them, and I have spoken with a company, actually was at that presentation I gave on PFAS, that is working on a way to remove it from soil, part of that boiling and then heating up the exhaust or the steam that comes out of the boiled material. But there's not like an in situ approach, if that's what you're asking.
Is there a certain threshold that's been established where that comes into play, or is that also in flux?
Also in flux, because I think what you're asking is, like, how would you treat it in, if you're asking how would you treat it in soil, there isn't a soil standard yet, so they don't know what's too much in soil. So what do you treat it down to, would be the question.
Are there any other questions before a quick wrap up, sir?
Yeah, just looking at that map, I live in Stratton Green, 2 out of the 3 wells we have are red. You mentioned somewhere, or someone did, about the town providing drinking water to an area. Does that area include those 2 wells?
So I want to check back on this is relatively new information about these exceedances, so I'm going to follow up on that, and I'll be in touch with your association.
My understanding is that, well, so we get water, but I believe it's because of the MCDE contamination, not from the PFAS contamination. PFAS. So I don't know if it would cross over yet, but.
So I want to look into that and get back to your association. If there's a leader or a point person from the association, I'd like to speak with them tonight. Right. And is there another question? Sure.
Based on the results, is there any sort of predictive modeling as to, using the fluorine-free phones that we have for the past 20 years, as to what those levels, 20 years ago, were they exponentially that much higher then, and for the people, at risk here? And then, is there any way to quantify, say how much Class B or A had to be released into the ground to get to these levels that we're seeing now, potentially 20 years later?
So the question is a good question, which is, what can we have expected to have dissipated?
We're training with PC-135s and crash trucks and jet fuel, at our fire station 20 years ago.
So in short, what would the levels have been 20 years ago utilizing those compounds, knowing that we haven't used them since?
I don't know. I wish I had a better answer after having you repeat it and all that. I guess it's possible. There are programs, there are models that do kind of back it out based, if you have all the inputs that you need for that model, soil porosity, current concentrations. I guess if you had enough input into the model that was worth something, you can back it out. Sea soil is a model that kind of backs out and predicts past concentrations, but.
Are the levels, I guess, within the monitoring wells, are they consistent with, other fire departments of
of what I've seen, yes, it's comparable, yeah.
So that was a question about whether what we have seen at our fire station for PFAS levels is comparable to others in the state that Jim has experience with, and he's answered yes. Another question?
I do, and I got to that in the NTV question too, because we looked at gas stations instead of, market gas belonging on MTBE and this is, well, we don't see this next was that furniture stripping place on the van and the gas station was monitored. Was Starbucks coming in and new facilities, are they all being monitored with the waters to make sure that they're free of these types of substances?
In general, public water supply wells are regulated and tested. So the state does do testing, not for all compounds though. Typically, they have a shorter list of compounds that they're looking for. If there's a reason to look for something because there's an adjacent site that has chemical X in it, then they may add that to the program. Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting in the context of that question that the property that brought this issue to life in Stratham in early March was a private property being redeveloped that was part of the pump test before going online with their water system. They were tested for PFAS, and that started off the chain that we've been talking about today. So at least in that instance, they tested for PFAS. Okay. Any other questions? I want to thank you very much for your attention, your coming here, and your good questions, engagement. As a reminder, this video that we've been taking tonight will appear on the website very shortly in the coming days. You can point your neighbors, your landlords, other people who might be interested in learning more about this issue can refer to this video or will live online. We'll be getting a summary of the question and answers out as well. Please provide us with your contact information so that you can be kept up to date on the town's process as we move forward. And Jim, I want to thank you very much for your preparation and mapping out the presentation tonight. And lastly, please introduce yourselves to either Nate Mears, me, or Jim, your connection to this issue. If we haven't heard from you tonight through your questions, please feel free to introduce yourselves, and we'd welcome that. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Dave.